The fear of facing humans. An alien war veteran shares haunting tales. The recorder light was already blinking when I sat down. Lyra Vashon placed her data slate on the table between us, pulled her stylus from the side clip, and smiled at me the way young researchers always smile at old veterans, gently, carefully, as if she expected something fragile inside. I am not fragile. I am something far more inconvenient than that. My name is Grell Vaken. For 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days, I held the rank of sub-commander in the 3rd Pacification Fleet of the Vorn Hegemony. I managed ground operations. I directed column advances across 7 human-held systems. I read every engagement report, every behavioral analysis, every tactical projection that came across my console during the human campaigns. I was very good at my work. I have not held a rank since the armistice was signed. I asked to be relieved that same morning. My superiors looked at my service record, then looked at me, and they did not argue. They had seen the field reports. More importantly, they had seen my eyes. I sat down across from Lyra Vashon and placed my hands flat on the table. I always do that now. It is the only way to stop them from doing things I do not want them to do in front of strangers. She activated the recorder. She gave the file designation and the date and my name. Then she looked up with that practiced, open expression researchers develop when they want subjects to feel comfortable, and said the words I have heard more times than I can count. Sub-Commander Vaken, thank you for agreeing to speak with us. The Galactic Remembrance Council is committed to preserving accurate first-person accounts of the human campaigns. Please know that you may pause or stop the recording at any time. I told her I understood. She looked at her slate. Her first question was about campaign duration. Her second was about engagement frequency. I answered both with numbers that meant nothing by themselves and everything in context, and I watched her write them down. Then she looked up and asked me what I remembered most clearly about the humans I had faced in combat. I looked at the door behind her head. I always look at doors now. I check that they open inward. I note whether the hinges are on the left or the right. I register what is visible through the gap if it stands open. I look at exits, at angles, at the space under furniture. This is what the human campaigns left inside me. A mind that has been permanently rearranged into something that assesses every room I enter, as though someone dangerous might already be in it. Sub-Commander? Lyra Vashon said gently. Forgive me, I said. I moved my eyes from the door back to her face. You asked what I remember most clearly. I remember everything most clearly. That is part of the problem. She wrote something on her slate. Perhaps we could begin with your earliest clear memory of an engagement that had a significant impact on you. They all had a significant impact on me, I said. That is also part of the problem. She waited. She was young, but she had clearly been trained in the art of waiting. She held her silence with patience and did not fidget. I found, after a moment, that I respected that. I am going to tell you 3 things, I said, not because they are the only things worth telling, but because they are the 3 things that, together, explain everything else. They are the 3 memories I cannot discuss with my physician without medication. They are the 3 events I replay most often in what passes for sleep. They were not the largest battles of the human campaigns. They were not the most costly engagements in terms of resources or personnel. I looked at my hands on the table. They were the moments I understood what we were facing, and understanding it did not help us. It only made us afraid in a way that strategy cannot address. Lyra Vashon had stopped writing and was simply watching me now. The recorder light blinked green between us. Before I begin, I said, I want to tell you something about myself. I want you to understand the context from which this testimony comes, because the Galactic Remembrance Council deserves accurate framing. Of course, she said. I am not a being who frightens easily. I managed ground operations in 3 prior pacification campaigns before the human campaigns began. I have seen species resist. I have seen species fight well, fight desperately, fight with the kind of terrible energy that comes from knowing that everything is lost. I have seen ambushes that nearly killed me. I have seen tactics I could not immediately explain. I am not describing these things to establish my courage, which is irrelevant to this testimony. I am describing them to establish my baseline. Before the human campaigns, I was not the kind of officer who checked doors. I paused. The room was very quiet. I check every door now, I said. I sit with my back to walls. I have not slept without waking suddenly in the dark, hands ready for something that is never there. Since the armistice was signed 11 years ago, every physician I have seen has attributed this to what they call operational stress. They are correct, but they have not understood what the stress was. The stress was not violence, or danger, or proximity to death. I had experienced all of those before. The stress was something different. It was the slow and accumulating certainty that I did not understand what I was facing, and that the things I did not understand were things that should, by any logic I had available to me, have been understandable. Lyra Vashon set her stylus down. She was not writing anymore. She was listening in the way people listen when they have understood that they are not going to be told what they expected. The human campaigns lasted 4 years and 3 months, I said. We entered them expecting 18 months at the outside. Our analysts were confident. The models were thorough. The precedents from prior campaigns were solid. We had pacified species with superior technology, superior numbers, and superior organizational capacity in less than a year. The humans, by our pre-campaign assessment, should have been simpler than any of them. I stopped. I looked at the recorder light. I am going to tell you about KL7 first, I said. Then I am going to tell you about Morn Station. Then I am going to tell you about a bridge over a river in a sector called Varen Crossing. And then, if you still want to ask me questions, I will answer them. I lifted my cup of water and drank from it slowly, and set it back down. The first thing you need to understand, I said, is that everything I am about to tell you happened after we had already done everything right. We followed doctrine. We were better equipped and better supplied, and better organized. We hit first and we hit hard, and we hit in ways that should have broken them at the beginning, before they had time to find whatever it was they found when they were under pressure. I met her eyes. What they found when they were under pressure is what this testimony is about, and I want you to know, before I tell you, that I have spent 11 years looking for something in our histories, our behavioral archives, our xenopsychology databases, any prior encounter with any species in recorded hegemony history that resembles what I witnessed. I have not found it, which means either the humans are genuinely unprecedented, or the records of our previous encounters are incomplete. Which do you think it is? Lyra Vashon asked. Her voice was very careful. I looked at her for a moment. I think the humans are genuinely unprecedented, I said, and I think that matters more than anything else in this record. I set my hands flat on the table again. I took one long breath. KL7, I said. 3 months into the campaign, we had subjected the colony to 47 hours of orbital bombardment before the ground assault began. I want you to understand what 47 hours of orbital bombardment means. Not technically. I want you to understand it as experience. By the time we descended, the colony's surface infrastructure was 73% destroyed. Their communication grid was down. Their power generation was gone. The garrison defending that colony had been sheltering underground for nearly 2 full days, under continuous fire from weapons they could not reach, could not stop, and could not avoid. Every prior species we had put through that process emerged from it diminished, quieter, cooperative with the reality of what was happening. I paused. The humans emerged fighting, I said. And not just fighting. They had been building while we bombed them. I will tell you exactly what I mean by that. She had picked up her stylus again. I watched her hand move across the slate, and I thought about what it would be like to be her, sitting across from me, recording the words of someone who had gone to KL7 and come back changed in ways they were still measuring 11 years later. You said they were building, she said. What did you mean? I mean that during the 47 hours we spent destroying the surface of their colony from orbit, I said, while fires burned and their shelters shook, and they had no power and no communications, and no way to know when it would stop. The human garrison was digging. They were mapping the damage patterns. They were using the craters we created as defensive positions. When our ground forces arrived, they found that the rubble we had made had been transformed into a prepared battlefield, designed specifically to fight us. Lyra Vashon looked up from her slate. They used our bombardment, I said. They watched where the impacts fell, and they noted the patterns, and they planned where our columns would be forced to advance, and they placed their fighters in the positions that would cause us the most damage before we could respond. They had no power. They had no communications network, so they were coordinating with runners, with physical messengers moving through rubble under ongoing fire, because they had adapted to the loss of everything electronic before we even landed. When my forward units reached the colony perimeter, they were met with resistance from defenders who were positioned specifically to take advantage of every piece of terrain that our own attack had created. I let that sit in the air for a moment. My first engagement report from the surface came 6 minutes after the lead column made initial contact. I said. The language my forward commander used was careful and professional, and underneath the careful professional language was something I had never heard in an engagement report before. He was confused. Genuinely, operationally confused. And so was I. And that feeling, that specific confusion of watching something behave in a way that your entire training says it should not be able to behave, that is where the human campaigns actually began for me. Not with the first shot, not with the first loss. With the first moment I looked at my tactical models and understood that the models were not going to be enough. The recorder light blinked green between us. Lyra Vashon was writing again, steadily, not looking up. I found I was grateful for that. It is easier to say certain things to someone who is looking at a slate. We secured KL7 on the 4th day, I said. It took us twice as long as projected, and cost us more than 3 times the projected casualties. Those numbers were classified at the time. I am telling you now because the classification served no purpose except to prevent the command structure from hearing what those numbers meant. What they meant was very simple. The models were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a foundational way. And we had 43 more colonies on the campaign list. I stopped. I looked at my hands. KL7 was the first time I understood that I did not understand what I was fighting. I said. It was not the last. By the time I understood it properly, we were at Morn Station, and that was a different kind of lesson entirely. There is something I need to explain about orbital bombardment before I describe what happened at KL7 in detail, because I think most beings who hear the term imagine something simple. A city struck from above, fires, collapse, the kind of destruction that is absolute enough that nothing survives it with any fighting capacity left. That image is wrong. And the reason it is wrong is important to everything else I am going to say. Orbital bombardment is not designed to kill everyone in the target area. If it were, it would simply be an extermination tool, and we would not need ground forces at all. What orbital bombardment is designed to do is destroy infrastructure and break morale. It destroys the grid, the communications network, the heavy weapons, the organized defensive installations. It burns the things that were built carefully over years, and makes the ones who built them watch the burning from underground, unable to stop it, unable to respond, forced to understand over the course of hours and then days that the power above them is so far beyond their capacity to resist, that resistance itself becomes meaningless. The goal is psychological. It is to make the defender feel small before the first boot touches the ground. We had done this to 3 species before the humans. We had done it in 11 different campaigns. We had a very clear picture, built from those campaigns, of what 47 hours of orbital bombardment produced in a defending force. It produced shock. It produced a specific kind of organizational paralysis, where units lost contact with each other and could not re-establish it. It produced an environment where survivors were focused entirely on staying alive, rather than preparing to fight. It produced, in short, exactly the conditions our ground forces were trained to exploit on arrival. What it produced at KL7 was none of those things. And the reason it produced none of those things is the thing that kept me awake in the first weeks after the battle, because it was so obvious in hindsight that I could not understand why I had not predicted it. And the answer was that nothing in my entire professional experience had given me a reason to predict it. The human garrison had, in the 47 hours of bombardment, performed an analysis. I want to be clear about what I mean by that word. Not a hasty improvisation. Not a desperate attempt to make the best of a collapsing situation. A deliberate, methodical, systematic analysis of the impact patterns of our strikes, the angles of our approach, the likely routes our ground columns would take, the terrain features the bombardment had created that could be used defensively, and the communication methods that would remain functional after all electronic systems were destroyed. They had worked through all of this during 47 hours of continuous fire from orbit. They had worked through it with no power, in underground shelters, with the walls shaking, and they had arrived at something that looked, when my first column reached the colony perimeter, like a prepared defensive position that had been designed specifically to fight our specific tactics in our specific conditions. I was at my command post 11 kilometers from the initial contact point. I had feeds from 4 different forward cameras and a direct communication link to my forward commander, an officer named Keth Solon, who had been with me for 2 prior campaigns, and who had never once sent me a contact report that contained anything I could describe as emotional content. On the 4th day of a difficult siege at our second campaign, I had received a report from him that said, essentially, defenders are using the terrain well. Expect delay. That was the most expressive language he had ever used. His first contact report from KL7 read as follows, and I am quoting from memory because I have read it often enough that I have retained it. Forward elements in contact with prepared defensive positions inside the strike zone. Defenders appear to have used crater fields and collapsed structures as fighting positions. Resistance is organized. Coordination between defender units appears intact. Request authorization for closer air support before continuing advance. The phrase I could not set aside was, coordination between defender units appears intact. After 47 hours of bombardment that had specifically targeted their communications grid, after 47 hours during which every satellite, every relay tower, every broadcasting antenna, every junction box in the colony had been struck, after 47 hours during which any electronic method of unit coordination should have been ash. I asked Keth Solon to clarify. He reported back, 11 minutes later, that human defenders appeared to be using runners, meaning physical messengers moving on foot, to maintain unit coordination, that they had apparently planned this communication method before the bombardment ended, not in response to its consequences, that the messaging system was fast enough to allow coordinated flanking responses to his column's advance within 3 to 4 minutes of a column movement. 3 to 4 minutes. On foot, through active rubble fields. I authorized the closer air support, and I sat and I looked at my tactical display, and I ran the numbers that I already knew were going to come out wrong, and they came out wrong, and I authorized 4 additional fire support passes, and called in a second column, and the fight for KL7's outer perimeter took 11 hours when our models had projected 3. 3 weeks later, sitting with Keth Solon in the operational debrief, I asked him to describe the defender behavior in his own words, not in the language of the report, but in his own words, as it had appeared to him in the field. He was quiet for a moment. Keth Solon was not a being who spent many words on things that could be said with fewer words, which is why his answer surprised me. He said, "Sir, I have fought in 7 campaigns. I have been in ground engagements against 4 different species. I have never had the experience I had at KL7, of feeling that the defenders knew what I was going to do before I did it." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Every time I tried to flank, the flank was already covered. Every time I identified a weak point in their line and moved toward it, the weak point was reinforced before I arrived. It was not just good tactical response. Good tactical response I would understand. It was the specific feeling of fighting something that had been sitting in the rubble for 2 days, under our fire, thinking very carefully about where I was going to come from and what I was going to try." He stopped. Then he added, "They used our bombardment, sir. They looked at what we did to their colony, and they used it." I thought about that statement for a long time. I thought about it during the next 8 engagements of the campaign, all of which produced variants of the same phenomenon. A defending force that had been subjected to conditions that should have broken their capacity to fight, and had instead used those conditions as raw material for something we had not planned for. A species that looked at the worst thing we could do to them and asked, systematically and without apparent panic, what they could build from it. The fighter who has stayed with me most clearly from KL7 is not one I ever met. Her name was Clara Bridges. She was 24 years old. She had been a geological survey technician before the campaign began, which meant her military training was less than a year old. She commanded a 6-person unit in the 3rd Defensive Ring that held for 7 hours against a much larger force because she had positioned her unit inside a collapsed water treatment facility in a way that forced every advance directly into a choke point she had mapped during the bombardment. I read her unit's engagement log after the battle when it was recovered. She had written her positioning notes by hand, in the dark, during the bombardment, on the back of a supply request form because there was no other paper available. Her handwriting was very small and very precise. She had drawn little diagrams showing the angles of fire from each position she chose, and the distance to each potential approach route. When I looked at her diagrams and then at the actual defensive positions her unit held, they matched exactly. She did not survive the campaign, but the 7 hours her unit bought at that choke point allowed an evacuation corridor to function that allowed a medical facility full of non-combatants to reach a safe zone before our column closed it off. She had known about the medical facility. The positioning was not coincidental. 24 years old. Less than a year of military training. Underground. In the dark. Under our bombardment. With a pen and a supply form and no power. I told the KL7 debrief committee that our models needed to be revised. They agreed in the language of bureaucracies, which is a language that agrees with things without changing anything. The models were not revised before Morn Station. By the time we reached Morn Station, I had stopped expecting the models to be right. What I had not yet understood was that the failure of the models was not a calibration problem. It was a fundamental problem. The models were built on assumptions about what beings under extreme pressure would do, assumptions drawn from our experience with many species. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong for humans. I did not understand that fully until Morn Station, and the way I understood it at Morn Station was not tactical, it was not strategic. It was something much stranger and much harder to put into an operational report. And the reason it is much harder to put into an operational report is that it happened at night, in silence, over a battlefield audio relay, when I heard something that I had never heard from an encircled and outgunned defending force in my entire professional career. I heard them singing. Before I tell you what that meant, I want to tell you what our situation was, because the situation was the context, and the context was everything. Morn Station was a transit hub, a civilian communications relay that had become militarily critical because of its position at the intersection of 3 resupply routes the Human Defense Network needed. We had cut it off in the 7th week of the campaign. Our cordon was tight enough that nothing was getting in and nothing was getting out. We had 1,200 personnel in the encirclement, which sounds substantial, but by the time we had been in position for 2 weeks, they had been on reduced rations for 10 days, had taken losses in 2 early breakout attempts, and had no resupply of any kind coming. Our analysts' consensus was that their effective fighting capacity was degrading at approximately 8% per day. At the end of the 2nd week, with the analysts projecting collapse within 72 hours, I was in my command shelter going over position reports when my communications officer said, with an expression I had not seen on his face before, "Sub-Commander, you should hear this." He opened the audio relay from the sector closest to the Morn perimeter. What came through was not what I expected. What came through was singing. Not a few voices. Not the disorganized sound of people making noise. It was organized, multi-part, rhythmically coordinated vocal production, coming from hundreds of individuals simultaneously, clearly rehearsed or familiar enough to all of them that they could perform it together without preparation. It was deep, and it moved slowly, and it had a quality I could not name immediately, which I would later understand to be resolve. Not the defiance of something angry, the resolve of something that has looked at what is coming and chosen to meet it standing up. I said to my communications officer, "How long has this been ongoing?" He said, "Approximately 20 minutes, Sub-Commander." I waited to see if it would stop. It did not stop. It continued for the next 2 hours, intermittently, with variations in the specific music, but not in the quality I have described. My translator unit eventually produced a rough rendering of the primary lyric, which was repeated across what appeared to be multiple different pieces of music. The rendering was imperfect, as translations of music always are, but the central meaning was consistent. We shall not be moved. I sat in my command shelter with the audio relay open and I listened to 1,200 surrounded, undersupplied, outgunned humans singing, and I did something I had not done in 7 campaigns. In 22 years of professional service, I sent a message to High Command that was not about tactics or logistics or projected timelines. I sent a message that said, as clearly as I knew how to say it, something is wrong with our models. These are not beings who are collapsing. I do not know what they are doing, but they are not collapsing. High Command's response told me to stay with the projected timeline. Morn Station fell on the 19th day, which was 14 days later than the projected timeline. It fell not to assault but to a negotiated surrender that the human commander, a colonel named Victor Aldgate, agreed to only after extracting specific conditions from us regarding the treatment of his personnel, and the language of those conditions was so specific and so carefully considered that my legal staff told me afterward that a treaty lawyer must have drafted them. Victor Aldgate had a treaty lawyer in his encircled, undersupplied, supposedly collapsing garrison. He had spent the 14 extra days, among other things, preparing for exactly the negotiation I was not expecting to have. That was the moment the confusion became something else. That was the moment I understood that the word for what I was feeling was not confusion anymore. The word was dread. I asked to interview Victor Aldgate after the surrender was processed. This was unusual. Commanders do not typically interview prisoners at that level, but I had been asking unusual things since KL7, and my staff had stopped questioning them. Aldgate was 51 years old. He had commanded at Morn Station for the entire 19 days of the encirclement. He was lean in the way that people become lean when they have been on reduced rations for 2 weeks, and there were rings under his eyes that spoke of very little sleep. But the thing that I noticed first and could not stop noticing was his posture. He sat across from me in the way that, I have since come to understand, certain humans sit when they want to project something specific. Not aggression, not fear, a particular kind of steadiness that is deliberate and communicates, I have thought about this moment, and I am ready for it. I asked him about the singing. He looked at me with an expression I did not have a word for at the time. I later decided the word was curious. Not threatened. Curious. As if my question was interesting to him. What about it? He said. Why? I said. Your force was encircled. Supplies were limited. Reinforcement was not coming. You had taken 20% casualties. The tactical analysis is unambiguous. What was accomplished by the singing? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone trying to find an answer. The quiet of someone deciding which answer to give. Have you ever been afraid? He asked. I told him that was not a productive direction for the conversation. He nodded slowly. He was, I think, not surprised by my answer. He said, when people are frightened, they can become isolated inside the fear. Each person is afraid alone. The fear makes you feel separated from everyone around you, even when they are standing next to you. Singing together is a way of breaking that isolation. You cannot sing together and feel completely alone. The sound of other voices becomes physical evidence that the others are still there, and you are still there, and you are all still going forward together. I looked at him. But the tactical situation did not change, I said. The tactical situation never changes because of how someone feels, he said. How someone feels changes what they are willing to do about the tactical situation. Those are different things. I held that sentence in my mind for 11 years. I am still holding it. Colonel Aldgate, I said, after a pause, in our analysis of the encirclement, we projected collapse of effective resistance within 48 to 72 hours of our initial projection point. You exceeded that projection by 14 days. I would like to understand what produced that result. He looked at me steadily. What produced it, he said, was that my people made a choice. Every day, they woke up, and they made a choice to keep going. That's not a tactic. That's not a resource allocation. It's a decision. And decisions don't appear in your models because decisions aren't predictable from the outside. Most beings under that pressure do not make that decision, I said. Most beings haven't practiced making it, he said. We've been practicing for a very long time. I ended the interview. I had more questions, but I had also begun to understand something that more questions would not help me understand any better. I walked back to my command post and I sat down and I looked at the updated campaign projections on my display, and I sent a new message to High Command that was longer and more specific than the previous one, and I said the thing that I had been trying to find the right words for since KL7. I said, the models are not wrong because our data is bad. The models are wrong because they are built on an assumption that is incorrect for this species. The assumption is that sufficient external pressure will eventually produce a collapse of the will to resist. That assumption is wrong. I do not know why it is wrong. I am trying to understand why it is wrong. What I know with certainty is that we cannot build a campaign strategy on it. High Command thanked me for my report and told me the Strategic Review Committee would be informed. The Strategic Review Committee met 6 weeks later. They updated one projection metric by 11%. They did not change the foundational assumptions. We continued into the campaign with the same models and the same foundational assumptions, and the campaign continued to produce results that the models did not predict and the assumptions could not explain. And then, in the 4th month, I went to Varane Crossing, and I saw something that made Kale 7 and Morn Station seem like preliminary lessons. I saw something that I have not been able to think about, in the 11 years since, without feeling the specific sensation of the ground shifting under my feet. I saw one person, and I understood, finally, that the thing I had been trying to put into words since the first contact report at KL7 was not going to fit into any operational report. Because it was not operational. It was something much older and much larger than operations, and it had been sitting inside every human I had encountered in this campaign, and I had been looking at the tactical surface of it without understanding what was underneath. What was underneath it was a choice, every single time. A choice. And choices, as Victor Aldgate had told me, do not appear in models. I did not tell Lyra Vashon about Victor Aldgate immediately. I told her about the songs first, because the songs were easier to describe, and because I needed to work up to Aldgate the same way I had needed to work up to everything about the human campaigns. Gradually, with the knowledge that once I said it, I could not unsay it, and it would sit in the record forever, available to anyone who wanted to read a broken officer's account of a war they thought they understood. The songs are easier because they can be described as sound, as a data point, as an anomaly in an audio file that my communications officer flagged because it was strange, and which I listened to, and which I have not stopped hearing since. What the songs are harder to describe is what they did to me while I was listening to them. I have already told you that Morn Station fell on the 19th day. I have told you about Victor Aldgate and the conversation we had. Let me tell you about the night between them, because that night is where the experience of the songs actually lives, not in the analysis. In the experience of sitting in a command shelter with a battlefield audio relay open, listening to 1,200 surrounded humans sing to each other in the dark. It was the 14th day of the encirclement. Our analysts had expected capitulation on the 5th day, then the 7th, then the 10th. Each recalculation had been accompanied by a memorandum explaining the deviation from the model, and each memorandum had attributed the deviation to a specific cause: unexpected resupply, unexpected reinforcement, medical factors, command factors, environmental factors. None of those explanations were correct, because the deviation from the model was not caused by any specific external factor. It was caused by the thing Victor Aldgate would describe to me on the 19th day: decisions, made daily, by 1,200 individuals who had not stopped making them. On the 14th night, with the encirclement intact, and our supply stranglehold complete, and no reasonable possibility of external assistance to the station, I was in my shelter reading position reports when the audio relay opened. I had established a continuous monitoring feed on all channels within the Morn perimeter as a standard intelligence practice, and the feed ran as background in my shelter throughout the campaign. I was accustomed to filtering it. Tactical chatter, movement calls, maintenance requests, the ordinary sounds of a military installation under siege. What I was not accustomed to was music. It started as a sound I could not immediately identify, low, structured, coming from multiple sources simultaneously, in a way that ruled out individual origin. I set down the report I was reading and turned to the audio console and increased the gain on the perimeter feed and listened. The best translation I have, composed by my translator unit working from recordings, is this. They were singing a song about not being moved, about a decision having been made and the world being invited to notice that the decision had been made and that no amount of external force was going to change it. The melody was slow. It had a quality I have struggled to describe and have finally landed on the word ancient, not because I knew its history, but because it sounded like something that had been sung before, many times before, in many bad situations before, and the fact that it had been sung before, in bad situations before, was somehow part of what it communicated. We shall not be moved. I listened to it for 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, I did not read any position reports. I did not review any tactical projections. I sat in my shelter with my hands on the console, and I listened to surrounded, undersupplied, outgunned human beings, singing in the dark, and I tried to understand what I was hearing. What I understood, sitting there, was insufficient. I understood that the singing was a morale practice, that it served a psychological function, that it was presumably having some effect on the unit cohesion of the garrison. My communications officer, when I asked him about it, offered a technical analysis. Coordinated vocal production in high-stress environments has been documented as a cohesion mechanism in several species. Sub-Commander, it is likely functioning as a shared behavioral anchor. He was correct. He was also completely inadequate to what I was hearing. What I was hearing was not a mechanism. What I was hearing was 1,200 beings who had been told by every external indicator available to them that they had lost, responding to that information by refusing it, not arguing with it, not denying it, refusing it, choosing, collectively, in the 14th night of an impossible encirclement, to make a sound together that said, "This is who we are, and you have not changed it, and we are still here." I closed the audio feed after 40 minutes. I sat for a long time. Then I wrote in my personal operational log, which was not an official document and was therefore somewhat more honest than my official reports, this sentence: "The humans appear to have a different relationship with the concept of losing than anything I have previously encountered. They seem to understand what it means but not to accept its implications." I have read that sentence many times since. It was close. It was not quite right. What I eventually understood, partly from Victor Aldgate and partly from everything that came after, is that the humans do not simply refuse to accept the implications of losing. It is something more specific than that. They have a capacity, which they appear to cultivate and practice and pass on across generations, to experience their situation with absolute clarity and simultaneously refuse to be defined by it, to know that they are losing, and to choose not to let the knowledge of losing determine what they do next, to metabolize the worst information available to them and convert it into something they can act on. The songs were not denial, they were practice. 1,200 people practicing, together, the conversion of terrible information into continued motion. I told Lyra Vashon this in different words, and she wrote it down, and then she asked me what happened after Morn Station. Not what happened tactically, what happened to me. I looked at my hands on the table. I changed how I wrote my reports, I said. I started including language about what I was observing behaviorally that did not fit the models, rather than simply noting the deviation from projected timelines. I started filing supplementary behavioral assessments alongside my tactical reports, which was not standard practice, and which generated a certain amount of frustration from the logistics staff, who processed the reports and did not know what to do with them. "Did anyone take the behavioral assessments seriously?" she asked. "One person," I said. Eventually. His name was Veth Torin, and he was the campaign's senior intelligence analyst, and he was very careful and very precise, and he came to see me 8 months into the campaign, after he had read enough of my supplementary reports to have concerns of his own. We spoke for a long time. He told me that he had identified a pattern in my reports that matched a pattern he had identified independently in the aggregate data from 37 other field commanders across 6 different systems. The pattern was the same in all of them. What was the pattern? Lyra Vashon asked. That the humans, in every engagement, in every context, in every tactical situation, from favorable to catastrophic, consistently performed beyond what any behavioral model predicted, I said. Not sometimes, not under specific conditions, consistently, Veth Torin said. And I want to be precise about his language because it was very careful language from a very careful person. He said that the human behavioral baseline, meaning the average level of resistance and resilience we could expect from any given human unit, in any given situation, was not a point on a scale. It was a direction. They did not stabilize. They did not plateau. They adapted, continuously. Every engagement produced information which they incorporated into the next engagement. They did not have a ceiling. Lyra Vashon had stopped writing. She was looking at me. Veth Torin filed a report to High Command, I said. It took 6 months to receive a response. The response acknowledged the pattern and directed that models be updated to account for a 15% increase in projected resistance capacity. 15%. We were off by something closer to 400%, and they gave us 15. I stopped. I picked up the water cup and drank. Veth Torin retired from intelligence work after the campaign, I said. I spoke to him twice afterward. He would not discuss the human campaigns. He said, the one time I pressed him, that he had spent the entire campaign watching the models fail, and writing about it, and being heard and not heard in exactly the same way, and that after 11 years he had decided that the experience had taken enough from him, and he was not giving it anything more. I thought about Veth Torin for a moment, about what it costs to be the person in the room who is right about something important, and cannot make anyone act on it. I understand that decision, I said quietly. I have considered it myself. The reason I am sitting here, speaking to you, in front of this recorder, is that I decided the opposite. I decided that the record matters, that someone who was there should say, as clearly as they can say it, what was actually happening, not the tactical version, the actual version. I looked at Lyra Vashon. The actual version is this, I said. We went into the human campaigns believing we were fighting a species. We discovered we were fighting a practice, something they had built into themselves, over time, through everything their history had put them through. A practice of choosing forward motion even when forward motion was irrational. Of making the decision to continue, even when the analysis said they should not be continuing. Of converting their own fear and loss and exhaustion into something they could use. I paused. The songs at Morn Station were not anomalies, I said. They were the most visible expression of a thing that was present in every engagement. At Kale 7, it was in the garrison digging defensive positions during orbital bombardment. At Morn, it was in 1,200 voices in the dark, and at Varian Crossing, it was in one person. One person who expressed that same thing in its most concentrated and most terrible form. I set the water cup down. I need to tell you about Varian Crossing now, I said. I have been working toward it since I sat down. I want to tell you while I still can. Lyra Vashon folded her hands and waited. The recorder light blinked green. Let me step back from Varian Crossing for a moment, because I realize I have moved through Morn Station quickly, and there is one more thing about Morn that belongs in this record. One more thing that happened during the 19-day encirclement that I have not told anyone, partly because it is hard to explain, and partly because when I have tried to explain it, the people I explain it to do not understand it immediately, and their failure to understand it immediately makes the thing seem smaller than it is. On the 17th day of the encirclement, we intercepted a personnel communication from inside the Morn perimeter. This was routine. We had been intercepting personnel communications throughout the campaign. Most of them were logistical, tactical, or personal, in the way that communications between soldiers always become personal when the situation is bad. But this one was different in kind, and my communications officer flagged it for my attention, and when I read it I understood why. The communication was from Colonel Victor Aldgate to his commanding officers, and it was a briefing about the encirclement, and what it said about the encirclement was not what a commander says when they are preparing for collapse. It was not a morale statement, which I would have understood and categorized. It was a strategic briefing. It described the current state of the encirclement in precise terms. It described our disposition, our supply lines, our known vulnerabilities. It described Aldgate's assessment of our command structure's probable response to 3 different scenarios he had identified, and it ended with a sentence that I have returned to more times than I can count. The sentence was, "They are waiting for us to stop. We will not stop." Not, "We cannot stop." Not, "We must not stop." "We will not." A future tense statement about a decision that had already been made, offered to his commanding officers as a piece of strategic information they could plan around. They are waiting for us to stop. We will not stop. I sent the intercepted communication to Veth Torin. He sent back a one-line response. This is what I have been trying to explain. And then, on the 17th night, 2 days before the surrender, I heard the singing again. It was different from the first time, not in the melody, which I later learned was a human piece of music with a long history that I will not pretend to understand, but in the number of voices. On the 14th night there had been hundreds. On the 17th night there were fewer. The voices were thinner, rougher, some of them clearly struggling. 19 days of reduced rations and physical stress, and the particular exhaustion of sustained siege conditions will do that. The music was not as full as it had been on the 14th night, but it was still there. That is the thing I cannot get past. 11 years later, when I lie awake at the time of night, when the difficult memories come. They were thinner, they were rougher, some of the voices cracked, and they were still singing. Not because it would change anything, not because it made tactical sense, because it was what they did, because they had decided who they were, and they were still being it, even in the 17th night of an encirclement that had already cost them badly, because the decision was not conditional on the outcome. I closed the audio feed on the 17th night, earlier than on the 14th. I went to my bunk, and I lay on my back and I stared at the ceiling of my shelter, and I thought about the sentence from the intercepted communication, and I thought about the voices, and I understood something that I had been approaching for weeks without being able to fully reach. The thing I understood was this. We had built a campaign strategy around the premise that any defending force has a breaking point, and that if you apply enough pressure, you will find it. This is not a cruel premise. It is a rational one, based on extensive evidence from many species. Every species has limits. Every species has the point at which the cost of continuing exceeds what it is possible to pay. What the humans appeared to have done, across their history and through whatever processes had shaped them, was locate their breaking point further than we could reach. Not infinitely far, not non-existent. Simply further than we could reach. Further than any other species we had encountered had placed it, and in locating it there, in the way they had built themselves, they had created a situation in which every strategy we had for finding that point failed, because the point was out past the range of our instruments. I wrote that formulation in my personal operational log on the 17th night. I looked at it for a long time. Then I added a single additional line. The line said, "I do not know what we do with this information. I still do not know what we do with it. I have spent 11 years not knowing. The armistice resolved the operational question, but it did not resolve the one underneath it, which is what it means, for the galaxy, that there is a species built the way the humans are built, what it means that they exist, what it means that they are out there, now, at peace with us, deciding things every day." I asked Lyra Vashon, at a certain point in our conversation, whether the Galactic Remembrance Council had interviewed many veterans of the human campaigns. She said they had interviewed over 400. I asked whether the testimonies showed a pattern. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "Several veterans have described a period after the campaign, during which they experienced significant difficulty reintegrating into ordinary life." "That is a diplomatic phrasing," I said. She looked at me steadily. "What would you call it?" I thought about it. "I would call it the difficulty of going back to a world in which you are not thinking about humans all the time," I said. "The difficulty of returning to ordinary risk assessments, and ordinary threat models, and ordinary assumptions about what people will and will not do under pressure, when you know that at least one species has made all those assumptions obsolete." She wrote that down. I watched her write it. "Tell me about Varan Crossing," she said, when she had finished writing. And so I told her. And I will tell you. The bridge at Varan Crossing was a standard prefabricated span, the kind the human colonists had been installing for decades, across rivers that inconvenienced their supply routes. 80 meters. Composite construction. Rated for heavy vehicles. There was nothing remarkable about it. I was commanding a supply column of 38 vehicles. The column included 6 heavy transport units carrying fuel and medical supplies to our forward positions, 12 armored escorts, and the remaining 20 were a mixture of support vehicles and field engineering units. The route had been assessed as secure. The sector had been quiet for 11 days. We had aerial reconnaissance from 30 minutes prior to our approach that showed no activity on or near the bridge. I was in the 5th vehicle from the front, a command track, watching the forward feeds on a display mounted to the interior bulkhead. I was reviewing supply allocation reports while we moved, because the intelligence about the bridge was solid, and there was no particular reason to give it more attention than any other transit point in a cleared sector. The first contact report came from the forward scout unit, 2 vehicles ahead of my command track, at 0947 local time. The report was 3 words: contact, single element. I looked up from the supply reports. My forward element commander, a young officer named Desh Lorvin, came on the command channel immediately. Single human combatant on the bridge. Standing position. No visible support. Assessing. Single. I ran the assessment in my head in the time it took Desh Lorvin to send the follow-up. A single combatant on an exposed bridge. No visible support. Against 38 vehicles. The tactical math was not complicated. Even accounting for the most favorable possible interpretation of what a single human soldier could do, the column had options that made any delay extremely short. I authorized the advance and told Desh Lorvin to handle it with minimum disruption to our timeline. We were already 11 minutes behind schedule from a maintenance stop. Desh Lorvin acknowledged. The column resumed motion. The next contact report came 90 seconds later. Lead vehicle disabled. Combatant has effective anti-armor capability. Weapon of unknown type. Repositioning to flank. I set down the supply reports. I moved to the forward camera feeds. The bridge was visible on the primary feed, and on it, clearly, was a single human figure moving to a new position along the structure, with a speed and economy of motion that I noted even then, even in that first viewing, as distinctive. Not panicked, not rushing, moving with the specific quality of someone who had already decided exactly where they were going, and was simply going there. Flanking element in position, Desh Lorvin reported. Initiating approach. I watched the flanking approach on the secondary feed. Two of our lighter armored vehicles moving along the riverbank to come at the bridge from an angle, rather than directly down the approach road. The flanking approach failed. I will describe this more precisely. It failed because the human combatant had already moved to a position that covered the flanking angle before the flanking vehicles had completed their movement. Not after. Before. He was in position before the flank arrived, which meant he had identified the flanking approach before our vehicles committed to it, and had repositioned to counter it without any apparent hesitation or recalculation, in the time it took our vehicles to move from their starting positions to the flanking angle. One of the flanking vehicles took a direct hit and was disabled. The other broke off the approach. I was fully present to what was happening now. The supply reports were gone from my mind. I was watching the feeds and I was thinking. And what I was thinking was already beginning to have the quality of thoughts that I recognized from Kale 7 and Morn Station, the thoughts that feel like the ground shifting, the thoughts that are the mind's first attempt to process something it was not prepared to process. Desh Lorvin, I said on the command channel. What are you seeing? He took a moment to respond, which was itself unusual. Desh Lorvin was not a hesitant officer. He processed fast, and he communicated fast, and he did not pause between receiving information and transmitting it. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way that I recognized from Keth Solan's field reports at Kale 7, the careful voice of a professional trying to describe something accurately when accuracy is difficult. Sub-Commander, he said, the combatant appears to be managing the engagement. Not simply responding, managing it. Each time we commit to a tactical movement, the combatant is already positioned to counter that movement. I have attempted 3 different approach vectors. All 3 have been anticipated. Estimated engagement duration? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Unknown, Sub-Commander, Desh Lorvin said. I cannot project an endpoint because I cannot project what counter-movement the combatant will make before I know what movement we will make. He is faster than my projection cycle. I sat with that for a moment. Faster than my projection cycle. The combat engagement model my forward commander was using was the standard model, updated regularly, designed to project enemy behavior from observed enemy behavior in order to plan optimal counter movements. The model required a certain amount of observed data to generate projections, and it generated those projections with a slight time lag while it processed. What Desh Lorvin was telling me was that the human combatant was outrunning that time lag. He was moving to counter our movements before the model had finished projecting what his counter-movement would be. In 8 campaigns, across 4 species, against opponents ranging from poorly trained militia to highly professionalized military forces, I had never received that specific assessment from a field commander. I watched the feeds. I watched the human combatant move through the bridge structure with the settled, purposeful motion I had noted at first contact, and I began to understand something that I would spend weeks afterward trying to articulate properly. He was not reacting. He was not responding to what we did. He had anticipated what we would do, had understood before the engagement began the full range of tactical options available to a column of 38 vehicles facing a single combatant on a bridge, and he had developed responses to each of those options before we had the chance to use any of them. He was not in a fight with us. He was executing a plan. I authorized a full column halt. I called Lorvin back from forward command, and I took direct control of the engagement. Over the following 2 hours, I tried 11 different tactical approaches to the bridge. I tried every combination of vehicle movement and infantry deployment that was available to me given my force composition. I tried direct approaches, flanking approaches, suppression and advance combinations, 2 separate attempts to use the river itself as an approach vector. I brought in air support for reconnaissance, and used the reconnaissance data to plan 3 separate attempts that I personally designed, rather than delegating to Lorvin, because by the 90-minute mark, I was not willing to believe that a single combatant could continue to anticipate and counter everything I designed, and I wanted to test whether my own tactical thinking was beyond his anticipatory capacity. It was not. He countered everything, not always cleanly, not always without cost to himself, because I could see on the feeds that 2 of our approaches had forced him into positions that were not optimal, and that one of those approaches had resulted in him taking a hit that changed his movement pattern for approximately 15 minutes before it normalized. But he countered everything. He was slower after the hit, and more limited in his positioning options, and he countered everything. At the 2-hour mark, I had 2 disabled vehicles and 7 personnel casualties, none of which were fatal but 2 of which required immediate medical attention. I had not advanced across the bridge. I had not dislodged the combatant, and I was looking at a supply delivery timeline that was deteriorating in real time against the needs of forward positions that were counting on what I was carrying. I authorized an assault with maximum available force across all approach vectors simultaneously. This is a tactic of last resort in a single bridge engagement because it is expensive and it concentrates all the losses into a short time window. But it is also, by the tactical math, the approach most likely to succeed against a single defending element because it exceeds the number of positions any single defender can cover. He covered 6 of the 8 approach vectors simultaneously, and was in the process of covering the 7th, when the 8th produced the result I had been seeking for 2 hours and 10 minutes. A weapon hit, his position identified, a clear targeting solution for 3 different units simultaneously. He went into the river. Not captured, not neutralized in place. Into the river. The Varan at that sector ran fast and cold, heavy with water from the high country where it originated, and our downstream observation units reported no visual contact with any human figure in the water or on either bank for the following 3 kilometers of search area. We crossed the bridge. We arrived at our primary destination, a forward command hub where our supplies were urgently needed, 4 hours and 17 minutes behind schedule. 4 hours and 17 minutes. I have told you what happened when we arrived. I have told you that the facility had been evacuated. I have told you that the evacuation was complete, that every person who needed to be gone was gone, that the only things we found were structures and equipment and the ordinary evidence of an installation that had been occupied until very recently by people who had since left with everything they could carry. What I have not told you is what I did after I confirmed the evacuation, because this is the part that does not appear in any operational report. And it is the part that Lyra Vashon asked me about specifically, in a quiet voice, after I had finished describing the bridge. What I did was sit down on the floor of the empty facility. I sat on the floor of a room that had been a planning center. There were still marks on the floor where the table legs had been, and I sat there, and I was very still, for a long time. My staff gave me a wide perimeter. They had learned, by that point in the campaign, to give me time when I needed it. Lorvin stood outside the room. He did not ask questions. He waited. What I was doing, sitting on that floor, was something I am not sure I can describe accurately, because it is not something that maps onto operational language, or tactical assessment, or any of the professional frameworks I had spent my career developing. I was sitting with what I had just learned, and trying to understand what it meant, and failing to fully understand it, and knowing that I would be failing for a very long time. Here is what I had just learned. One human soldier, whose name I did not know at the time, who I would learn much later was named Nathan Cole, who had been a teacher of mathematics before the campaign, had held a bridge against 38 vehicles for 2 hours and 10 minutes. He had done this not by being stronger than 38 vehicles, or by having weapons superior to 38 vehicles. He had done it by being smarter, in a specific and practical and deeply deliberate way, about exactly what the bridge required of him, and exactly how much he had to give. He had made a calculation. He had decided what the bridge was worth, and he had decided what he was willing to give for it, and he had given precisely that much with a precision that I found, sitting on the floor of that empty facility, almost incomprehensibly difficult to absorb. The evacuation had needed 4 hours. He had provided 4 hours and 17 minutes. Not approximately 4 hours. Not roughly 4 hours. 4 hours and 17 minutes. As if he had known exactly what was needed and had worked out, before the first vehicle in my column rounded the bend and saw him standing in the center of the bridge, how to provide it. I found his dossier 3 months after the armistice, when the records became accessible. He was 31 years old. He had taught mathematics at a secondary school. He had been enlisted for 14 months. His service record before Varian Crossing was competent and unremarkable. There was one performance evaluation that said he had excellent spatial reasoning and strong logical problem-solving skills, which I read sitting at a desk in my post-campaign office and felt land in my chest with a specific weight. In his personal effects, recovered from the bank of the Varian 3 kilometers downstream from the bridge, there was a photograph. A woman, a small child, a house with a garden. On the back, in handwriting that the record described as neat, 2 words, "Come back." He had looked at that photograph. He had put it in his pocket. He had walked to the bridge and stood in the middle of it. I am not going to tell you that I wept, sitting on the floor of that empty facility, because that is not accurate. What I am going to tell you is that I sat there for a long time, and when I stood up and walked out, I walked differently than I had walked before. And I have walked that way since, every day. The way someone walks when they have understood something they cannot unknow. What I had understood was not about the bridge. The bridge was a single event. What I had understood was the bridge as evidence of something larger than itself. The thing the songs at morn had been evidence of. The thing the defensive positions at KL7 had been evidence of. The thing that Victor Aldgate had described to me in his careful way when he said that people who have practiced making a decision are different from people who have not. The bridge was the clearest possible demonstration of what that practice produced, what it looked like in its most concentrated form, what it could do. Nathan Cole had not held that bridge because he was told to. There was no superior present. There was no unit around him. He was, by every measure available, alone on that bridge with 38 of our vehicles approaching, and he had decided, alone, based on whatever internal accounting he had done with himself, that the bridge needed holding and that he was the one available to hold it. The decision did not produce glory. It produced 4 hours and 17 minutes, and then the river, and then a photograph on a bank 3 kilometers downstream. I told Lyra Vashon all of this. When I finished, she was not writing. She was looking at me with an expression that I recognized, because it was the expression I had seen on every face that had heard this story all the way to its end. The expression of someone who has just encountered something that they understood before only as an idea, and now understands as a fact, and who is working out what that change means. Did the hegemony know, she said carefully, at that point, that the campaign was not going to produce the outcome that was projected? Some of us knew, I said. Those of us who had been in the field long enough. Veth Torin knew. I knew. Several other field commanders knew, though we used different language for it. What we knew was that we had been operating on wrong assumptions for the entire campaign, and that correcting those assumptions did not produce better projections. It simply produced wider uncertainty intervals and longer estimated timelines. When did the hegemony leadership know? She asked. I paused. I thought about the answer carefully. When we told them, I said. They knew when we told them. The question was, what they did with knowing. She waited. What they did, I said, took another 8 months. And by the end of those 8 months, there were more bridges. Lyra Vashon sat back slightly. It was the first time since I had started talking that she had moved in a way that suggested something physical was happening in her, not just the accumulation of data. More bridges. she said. More bridges, I said. More Varayan crossings. Not the same bridge, not the same person, not the same tactical situation, but the same phenomenon, the same evidence of the same thing. A soldier, or a group of soldiers, in a situation that should have produced either retreat or surrender, choosing instead to hold something, or do something, or buy something, not because they were ordered to, but because they had looked at the situation and decided what it required of them, and found themselves willing to provide it. I looked at my hands. In the 4th month, I started keeping a separate log, not operational, not tactical, personal. I wrote down every incident I encountered that I could not explain with conventional behavioral models, and I tried to find the common thread between them. I accumulated 47 incidents over the following 3 months, and the common thread I found was not strategic intelligence or superior equipment or lucky tactical positioning. The common thread was choice. Every single incident, stripped of its specific details, was an account of a human being choosing to do something that the circumstances did not require them to do, and that cost them significantly. Choosing to hold when retreat was available. Choosing to act when inaction was survivable. Choosing to pay a price that by any external calculation exceeded the tactical value of what they were purchasing. I stopped. I thought about how to say the next thing. I sent that log to Veth Torin, I said. He read it and sent back a one-line response. He said, I have 52 more incidents to add to your list. Lyra Vashon was writing again. I watched her for a moment, and I thought about the record, about what it means to put something in a record, about whether the record would do anything that the conversations and reports and memos had failed to do during the campaign itself. The hegemony made peace, she said, without looking up, when the campaign was 4 years old. What changed at that point? Why then? Nothing changed at that point, I said. That is the most important part of the answer. Nothing changed at year 4 that had not already been true at year 2 or year 3. What changed was that the aggregate of the evidence had finally accumulated to a weight that could not be administratively managed anymore. You can respond to one field commander's behavioral anomaly reports with a recommendation to update projection models. You can respond to the combined behavioral anomaly reports of 200 field commanders with another recommendation to update projection models. You cannot respond to the combined behavioral anomaly reports of 200 field commanders, plus 4 independent intelligence analyses, plus the aggregate casualty data from 67 engagements, plus the personal testimony of the campaign's senior behavioral analyst, who resigned from his position in order to be free to speak without institutional constraints, by updating projection models. I looked at her. At year 4, we had all of those things, I said, and they pointed, all of them, at the same conclusion. We were not going to win. Not because we lacked the capacity, not because we had made strategic errors, though we had made some, because the thing we needed in order to win was for the humans to stop, and the humans were not going to stop, and the reason they were not going to stop was built into them, in a way that nothing we were doing was reaching. I paused. The hegemony's leadership made the decision to seek armistice, I said. The decision was framed publicly as a humanitarian gesture and a commitment to peaceful coexistence. That framing was not inaccurate. It was also incomplete. The complete framing would have included the word exhaustion. We were exhausted, not defeated in the classical sense, exhausted by a campaign that kept producing things we did not know how to respond to, conducted against an opponent that kept making choices we did not know how to anticipate. Lyra Vashon set down her stylus. She looked at me for a moment. And what did the humans say? She asked, when we sought armistice. I looked at the recorder light. That, I said, is what I need to tell you last. The armistice negotiations were held in a facility that belonged to neither side, a research station on a moon at the edge of the contested space, staffed by a neutral third party that both sides had agreed to accept as intermediary. I was part of the hegemony delegation. I had been asked to join it by the campaign director, a senior official named Koveth San, specifically because of my behavioral reports from the field. He said he wanted someone present who had actually spent time trying to understand the humans, rather than simply managing the campaign against them. I understood why he wanted that. I was less certain that having me present would help in the way he hoped. The human delegation was led by a woman named General Adele Marsh. She was 63 years old, which in human terms means she was old enough to have been in 2 previous conflicts before ours, and experienced enough that her record showed a specific pattern I had learned to identify in human officers who had been fighting for a very long time. The pattern of someone who had made a great many decisions under bad conditions, and had made enough of them correctly to be trusted with more decisions. She was not what I expected. I am not sure what I expected. Something more visibly victorious, perhaps. Something that expressed the confidence of an opponent who had successfully resisted a campaign for 4 years and had watched their opponent come to the table. Human expressions are difficult for Vorn to read at the best of times, but I have become better at reading them over the years, and what I read in Adele Marsh's face across the negotiation table was not satisfaction, it was not gloating, and it was not the careful concealment of gloating. It was tiredness. She was tired. They were all tired. The human delegation, across 6 individuals, showed the specific kind of fatigue that accumulates over years rather than days, the kind that lives in the way a person holds their shoulders, and the time it takes them to move from one position to another. They were courteous. They were professional. They were, in my assessment, genuinely interested in reaching an agreement quickly and getting home. And I say genuinely, not as a diplomatic characterization, but as a behavioral observation. The cues I had learned to read in humans across 4 years of campaign observation were all consistent with people who wanted this to be over. I had not expected that. I had expected, from the position they were in, something that felt more like power. They had held us for 4 years. They had resisted everything we had brought to bear. They had produced Nathan Cole and Victor Aldgate and Clara Bridges and 47 incidents in my personal log and 52 in Veth Torrens, and more, I am certain, that neither of us ever catalogued. They had the position of strength at that table. I expected them to use it. Instead, on the first day of negotiations, Adele Marsh opened the session by saying, and I am quoting from the official transcript which I have read many times, "We understand that the hegemony is seeking a framework for peace. We share that objective. We have prepared a set of conditions for the ceasefire and armistice that we believe are reasonable and achievable, and we are prepared to work with your delegation to address any concerns about their implementation. We would like to complete this process as quickly as possible, because our people are tired, and we believe yours are too. Our people are tired, and we believe yours are too." I wrote those words in my personal log that night, in the temporary quarters the neutral party had allocated to our delegation. I wrote them down because I needed to keep them somewhere outside my head, where I could look at them from the outside and think about what they meant. What they meant, as far as I could work out, was that Adele Marsh had made a choice, not the choice to negotiate from strength, which was available to her, the choice to negotiate from exhaustion, to acknowledge that her people had been doing something very hard for a very long time, and that they wanted to stop doing it, not because they could not continue, but because continuing had costs, and the costs were real, and she was not going to pretend they were not. It was, I realized, the same thing I had been watching for 4 years. The thing the songs at morn were about. The thing Nathan Cole had done on the bridge. The thing that Clara Bridges had expressed in her hand-drawn diagrams by the light of a lamp during orbital bombardment. Not the absence of cost, the acknowledgement of cost, and the willingness to continue in spite of it, or in this case the willingness to stop when stopping, was the right thing to do. We were tired. They were tired. They said so plainly. And then they worked efficiently and professionally through 11 days of negotiation and produced an armistice agreement that was, by the assessment of every legal and diplomatic expert I subsequently consulted, fair to both parties. Not favorable to them. Fair to both parties. I spoke with Adele Marsh twice outside the formal sessions. Once in a corridor on the 4th day, when we happened to leave the session room at the same moment and walked the same direction for 40 seconds before our paths diverged. She said, in those 40 seconds, while looking at the floor ahead of her rather than at me, "This was a terrible thing. I hope we can do better than this." I said, "I hope so too." It was the most honest exchange I had during the entire campaign, including all of my operational reports and my conversation with Victor Aldgate and my 11 months of supplementary behavioral assessments. It was 11 words, and it was the most honest exchange of the campaign. The second time I spoke with her was on the last evening of the negotiations, at the informal reception the neutral party hosted after the final documents were initialed. She found me near the window of the reception room, standing with a cup of something I was not drinking, and looking out at the moon's surface, which was gray and still, and very quiet. She stood beside me, and looked out the window and said, after a moment, "I read your behavioral assessments." I looked at her. "Not during the campaign," she said. "After. When the records became accessible, someone on our intelligence staff had access to them early in the process, and found them interesting, and passed them to me." She paused. "They were accurate." I considered this for a moment. "They did not help us," I said. "No," she said. "They couldn't. Understanding something and being able to stop it are different things." She looked out at the moon's surface. "You understood us. You just couldn't stop us." I sat with that for a long moment. "I have one question," I said. "One question that I would like to ask, if you are willing to answer it." She turned to look at me. Her face was calm. Tired, as it had been throughout the negotiations, but calm. "Why did your people keep going?" I said. "Not tactically. Not strategically. I understand those answers. I mean underneath those answers. Why does your species keep going when the cost is what it was? Where does that come from?" She was quiet for a moment. A long moment. The kind that is a genuine consideration rather than a pause for effect. "We've had to," she said. "We've been in bad situations for a very long time. Long before we had ships that could take us to other systems. We learned a long time ago that stopping when things are terrible doesn't make them less terrible. It just means you stop." She looked back out the window. "We're not special. We're just practiced." Practiced. Victor Aldgate had used the word. Adele Marsh used it too. I have thought about that word for 11 years. About what it means that a species describes its most remarkable quality. The quality that held off the hegemony for 4 years. As practice. As something learned. As something that was once absent and became present through repeated application. It means, I think, that it is not destiny. It is not innate. It is a choice that became a habit, that became a culture, that became, eventually, something so fundamental to how they understand themselves that it feels like nature. But it started as a choice. Someone, at some point, in some terrible situation, decided to keep going when stopping was available. And it worked. And they told the people around them, and those people told their children. And across thousands of years of bad situations, the decision calcified into something that looked, from the outside, like an inexhaustible resource. It is not inexhaustible. They told us that themselves. They were tired. Adele Marsh was tired, and she said so. And it was not weakness. It was honesty. And the honesty was possible, because tiredness was not the same as stopping. That is the thing. That is the thing I have been trying to articulate across every report and every debrief, and every conversation, and every sleepless night since the armistice was signed. The thing that the hegemony's models missed, and that our strategy could never account for, and that I believe the Galactic Remembrance Council needs to understand and keep in its records, so that whatever comes after the human campaigns is built on a correct understanding, rather than the incorrect one we had at the start. Tiredness and stopping are not the same thing. That seems obvious when I say it out loud. It is not obvious in practice, because our models treated them as the same thing, and so did the models of every prior campaign I had participated in, because for every other species we had ever encountered, tiredness and stopping were closely correlated. Tiredness produced stopping. Sufficient tiredness always produced stopping. We had built a whole framework of war on that premise. Apply enough pressure, produce enough tiredness, and stopping would follow. For the humans, the correlation is different. For the humans, tiredness and stopping are separate variables that happen to be connected in some situations but not others. They can be tired and still going, or they can be rested and choosing to stop, and the deciding factor between those states is not their physical or psychological condition. The deciding factor is what they decide. This is what makes them unlike any other species we have documented. Not their technology, not their biology, not their organizational capacity. Their relationship with the decision about whether to continue. The specific architecture of that decision, and what feeds into it, and what does not feed into it. What does not feed into it, in the way it feeds into every other species' decision architecture, is the cost of continuing. The cost is real. They feel it. Adele Marsh felt it, and Nathan Cole felt it, and Victor Aldgate felt it, and 1,200 soldiers at Morn Station felt it in their voices on the 17th night, when the songs were thinner and rougher and still present. The cost is real, and they experience it fully, and they continue anyway. Because the decision about whether to continue is upstream of the cost, not downstream from it. It is upstream. That is the sentence I could not write during the campaign, because I did not have the language for it yet. The decision comes first. What it costs comes after. And because the decision comes first, no amount of manipulating the cost can reach the decision, because the decision has already been made. I told Lyra Vashon all of this, and when I finished, the recorder light was still blinking green, and the room was very quiet. She looked at me for a long time. Her stylus was on the table, not in her hand. She had stopped writing at some point during this last section, and had simply listened, which is, I think, the correct response to the end of this story. The correct response is to stop writing and listen, and sit with what you have heard. "Do you hate them?" she said. It was the question I had been waiting for since the beginning of our conversation. The question that is always at the end of this story. The question that people ask because they need to know where I stand in relation to what happened. I looked at my hands on the table. "No," I said. I thought about it. For a long time after the armistice, I sat with the question of whether what I felt toward the humans was hatred, or something adjacent to it. I had lost people I cared about. I had been wrong about things that mattered. The campaign cost the hegemony a great deal, and cost me personally more than I can fully account for. I stopped. What I found, when I sat with it long enough, was not hatred. What I found was something I did not have a word for in my own language, and have since constructed from borrowed pieces. The closest I can come is this. When I think about Nathan Cole on that bridge, when I think about the songs at morn, when I think about Clara Bridges in the dark with her pen, and her supply forms, and her careful diagrams, I feel something that is very large, and very complicated, and that contains inside it, somewhere at the center, something I can only call respect. I looked at Lyra Vashon. "Not tactical respect," I said. "Not the professional respect of one military actor for another. Something older than that. The respect you feel for something that has shown you what a thing can be, when it is being as fully itself as it is possible to be. I have been afraid of the humans every day since I first stood on Kale 7, and understood that the models were wrong. That fear has not diminished. I check doors. I sit with my back to walls. Some nights I hear something that is not quite silence, and I lie still, until I can determine what it is." I was quiet for a moment. "And I am glad they exist," I said. "That is the other half of it. And the half that I could not have predicted, and the half that I think matters most for this record. The species that gave me 11 years of sleepless nights. The species that held a bridge with one 23-year-old mathematics teacher, and sang in a surrounded station, and used our bombardment to build their defense. That species is out there. It is a real thing in the galaxy. It exists, and I have looked at what it means that it exists. What it means that something capable of what they are capable of is part of the same galaxy we are part of. And my answer, arrived at slowly and with considerable difficulty, is that I am glad." I placed my hands flat on the table. I looked at the recorder light. "That is everything I have to say," I said. "The record can have it." Lyra Vashon looked at me for a very long time. Then she reached out and turned off the recorder. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. We sat in the quiet of the room together for a moment, which felt appropriate. Then I stood, and she stood, and I looked at the door, and checked that it opened inward, and that the space beyond was clear. And I walked out into the corridor, where the lights were ordinary, and the sounds were ordinary, and the world was at peace, carrying what I had always carried, and what I would always carry, the fear and the glad of it together, inseparable, the way they had been since the first morning I stood on Kale 7, and understood that I did not understand what I was facing. I understood now. It did not help with the fear. Nothing helped with the fear. But I was glad. I walked the corridor for a few moments alone before my staff found me. They always knew when to give me space and when to close in, which is one of the things that makes a good staff, and I had been fortunate in my staff throughout the campaign even when I had not been fortunate in much else. Lorvin was waiting near the entrance to the delegation quarters. He fell into step beside me without speaking, which was the thing he had learned to do in the later months of the campaign, and we walked together in silence for a while. After a few steps, he said quietly, "How did it go?" "It went," I said. He nodded. That was sufficient. He had been with me for the last 2 years of the campaign, and he understood what this particular conversation cost, and he did not require more than that. I thought about Lyra Vashen's face when I said the word glad. I thought about how her expression had changed, very slightly, in the way expressions change when someone hears something they were not expecting to hear and are not sure yet what to do with it. She would write it into the record accurately. I was confident of that. She was a careful person who took the record seriously, and she would write it accurately, and the accurate version would be strange to whoever read it, and that was all right. The strange version was the true version. I thought about Nathan Cole. I thought about the photograph on the bank. I thought about what the photograph meant, and what the bridge meant, and what the river meant, and what the 4 hours and 17 minutes meant, and I thought about whether I had done justice to any of it in what I had just told Lyra Vashen. I decided I had done as much justice to it as I could. There is a limit to what words do. There is a limit to what records capture. The thing itself, the specific quality of what the humans had shown me, and what it had done to me, that thing lives somewhere that words can gesture toward, but cannot fully reach. I have gestured toward it as well as I know how. The record will have what I gave it. Lorvin stopped at the door of my quarters. "Is there anything you need, sir?" he said. I considered. "No," I said. "Thank you." He nodded and walked on. I stood at the door of my quarters for a moment. I looked at the door, which opened inward, with clear space visible beyond the threshold. Old habit, not going away. I went in. Behind the door, the room was ordinary, dim and quiet, the way rooms are in the early evening before the light has been adjusted. I stood in it for a moment, and let the ordinary quality of it settle over me, the way I always did after speaking about the campaign, because the speaking always takes you back into it in a way that requires time afterward to come out of. I set my things down. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the floor. I thought about what it means to share a galaxy with something, not just to exist in proximity to it, not just to have encountered it, but to share the galaxy with it in the full sense, the sense that includes knowing it is there, and knowing what it is, and having to hold that knowledge in the same mind that holds everything else. I have shared a galaxy with the humans for 11 years of peace. I will share it with them for the rest of my life. Whatever they do in that time, whatever they build or explore or suffer or celebrate, they will do it in the same galaxy that I am in, and the knowledge of that is a constant. It is a constant that is simultaneously frightening and something better than frightening. Something that does not have a clean name, but that I have learned to carry the way you learn to carry anything, by understanding its weight and adjusting to it over time. The weight of knowing that they are there. The weight of what they showed us they were capable of. The weight of Nathan Cole, and the songs at morn, and Adele Marsh saying, "We're just practiced," in the quiet beside a window on the moon. And Lyra Vashen, who will put it all in a record, and the record will go somewhere, and be read by someone who was not there, and who will try to understand what it means. I hope they understand. I hope the record is enough for them to understand. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. The room was quiet. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the facility moved through the walls, footsteps and voices and the low hum of systems doing what systems do. No singing, not tonight. Some nights, not often but sometimes, I hear something in the way the silence arranges itself that has the quality of music. Not real music, the memory of music, which the mind produces on its own, sometimes, when the conditions are right. I have heard it at intervals since Morn Station. I have learned not to reach for it, which only makes it disappear. If I lie still and let it exist in the particular way it exists, it will sometimes persist for several minutes, faint and low and slow, the specific quality I heard through the relay in my shelter on the 14th night of the encirclement, and the 17th, when the voices were thinner but there. I lay on the bed in my ordinary room in the quiet of a galaxy at peace, and I waited to see if the music would come. And I thought, as I always think at these moments, that this is what it means to have been there. To carry not just the memory but the experience of the memory, the thing that the memory does when it comes back, The way it brings with it the full weight of the understanding that arrived alongside it. Nathan Cole and the bridge. Aldgate and his careful conditions. Clara Bridges in the dark with her pen. Adele Marsh saying we have had to. As if the answer to why were so simple it barely required a sentence. As if 1,000 years of choosing to continue in terrible situations was just a thing that had happened and left a mark, the way all things that happen in terrible situations leave a mark. They left a mark on me. The humans left a mark on me in the most literal possible sense. And I carry it every day, and it looks like checking doors and sitting with my back to walls. And it also looks, sometimes, late at night in quiet rooms, like lying still and listening for music. The music did not come that night. But it has before, and it will again. And when it does, I will lie still and let it exist for as long as it will, and then it will be gone, and I will be in the ordinary quiet room, in the ordinary quiet galaxy that I share with the humans, and I will be all right. Not healed, not fixed, not no longer afraid. All right. That is what the human campaigns left me with, in the end. The fear and the glad, and between them the knowledge that both are true and neither cancels the other, and that this is what it means to have understood something fully enough that it has become part of who you are. I am afraid of them, every day. I am glad they exist, every day. The record has it now. That will have to be enough.